Only the vine weaver birds in the trees saw them coming. The 7 creatures wore garments as red as blood and carried bags upon their backs. Their skins were as pale as the skins of things that live beneath stones. Their eyes blinked and watered. They had the bodies of small humans, but their faces were like the faces of dogs. The birds had never seen creatures like them and wondered who and what they were. The 7 creatures whispered together, looking here and there, and they glanced behind them as though they feared they were pursued. One, the largest of all, clutched his chest as though beneath his clothes he carried something precious, something he should not have. Our quest is gone. He said in a ringing voice, "We will survive. We will tell our story. We will find our people their place in the sun." "Yes," agreed his companions, but fear and guilt twisted their faces, showing that they were not sure. Just then, a man came creeping to drink at the pool that lay before the dragon's den. His name was Ben Ozma. His hair was wild and his beard was long. His clothes hung in rags about him. He had lived alone in the hills for many a long year, and the birds knew him well. Ben Ozma had visited the pool each day at sunrise, when he knew the dragon would be away from its den. On this morning, he was to go thirsty. He saw the 7 creatures who had come from the underworld and screamed in horror and disgust. The creatures drew back from them, snarling and pulling bone knives from their belts. "Goblins!" Ben Ozma had cried, and so the birds knew how to name the 7 creatures and called them goblins from that moment. Ben Ozma had seized a stone from a bag that hung from his belt. With the ease of long practice, for the hills were dangerous, he threw the stone hard and straight. It hit the smallest goblin in the center of her brow. Her heart stopped beating, and she fell dead upon the ground. Her companions leapt forward, their weapons raised, but Ben Ozma turned and ran. And in moments he had disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The goblins knelt, grieving by their dead companion. "The beings of this place are as ugly and as savage as some were told," one said at last. "Now we are only 6. Perhaps we should turn back." "There can be no turning back now," the large one answered grimly. "We made our decision and must abide by it." So the goblins buried their slain companion in a shallow grave and left that place. They threaded their way through the tall trees until they reached the end of the forest shade. The harsh rocks tore their tender feet, and the bright sun hurt their eyes and burned their pale skin. But they bound grass and leaves around their feet and pulled hoods over their heads. And they stumbled on in a ragged line, their bone knives in their hands. High above them, many dragons soared on the wind. The goblins did not notice them, for though the dragons' backs were cold as the sun, their undersides were palest blue to match the sky. The dragons saw the goblins and sensed that these red-cloaked strangers were both of their land and not of it. They were curious, but did not bother to come to land. The wind was cool and pleasant beneath their wings, and besides, they had breakfasted well already. Breakfasted. It's an interesting word. Many other eyes watched the goblins as they passed. The sharpest of these gleamed hungrily from stinking dens beneath the rocks, made him show us how to open it. Too late now. The first voice now. If only God next to me will show us before it dies. Now, let me eat in peace. There's still meat on this bone. Cold with horror, the 5 remaining goblins ran. They ran until they had reached the end of the hills and stumbled down to a grassy plain beyond. Darkness was falling, but still they forced themselves to continue, for they could see distant lights ahead. They reached a lonely farmhouse and looked through its glowing window. A pot of soup bubbled on a black iron stove. A woman dozed in a chair. A little child played with wooden toys on a rug at their feet. These beings are hideous to look upon, but they do not seem savage. The largest goblin whispered, "We will make them listen to our story." So he tap, 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 at the window. The child looked up from his play, saw the goblins' faces, and screamed. The woman jumped up in fright. Then she, too, saw the goblins. With a cry, she seized the pot of soup from the stove and threw it at the window with all her might. The heavy pot crashed through the glass. The 4 goblins sprang aside, but the 5th paused an instant to draw his blade. It was too slow. Boiling soup poured over him, burning his tender flesh. Howling, he fell to the ground, and his heart was pierced by his own bone knife. The woman and the child were screaming, screaming, screaming. The 4 goblins left alive heard hoarse shouts and the sound of heavy feet bounding towards the farm. Ships of many lands lay in the bay. There was much buying and selling in the market square, plentiful talk and gossip too. Hidden in dark corners, skulking in foul-smelling alleyways, the goblins heard news of trouble from the far north, of attacks by bandit hordes and fearsome creatures who were said to be controlled by some dark power beyond the mountains. Those tales were likely told. The people of the south cared nothing, it seemed, for the troubles of the north. Stories of goblins terrorizing the countryside around the town were a different matter, however. When men and women spoke of these, their faces darkened and they gathered the children close around them. The goblins thought it best to be gone. They, too, had a tale to tell. But they had by now lost hope that they would ever tell it in this crowded, fearful town. "You will go to the west," the leader said. "Have we not the savages in this town chatter of a magic city there? Have we not heard the savages in this town chatter of a magic city there? Surely the people of such a city will listen to us." They spent an hour gathering food by creeping into sleeping houses. The hungriest among them found a tray of raisins on a pantry floor. Gleefully, she ate her fill, then tipped what remained into her food bag, thinking that her friends would never know of her greed. But the raisins were poisoned, set out by the owner of the house to kill rats. The goblin lived just long enough to warn her friends, then died horribly in their arms. Under cover of darkness, the 3 remaining goblins fled the town and traveled west. For weeks they wandered, stealing scraps of food to live and sleeping in wretched holes. Their garments were thin rags, their minds were filled with rage and pain. At last, the weakest of them died of hunger, cold and broken-hearted. The 2 remaining buried her and went on, though by now they hardly knew why. One day, at dawn, they saw a bright green field beside the road. Faint with hunger, the smaller of the 2 goblins staggered into the field. He had hoped to eat of the flat, broad-leaved plants growing there. Instead, the plants ate him. The moment he touched one, jaws opened in its center and his arm was swallowed whole. In seconds, he was sucked, screaming, into the plant's gaping throat and was gone. Now only one goblin remained, the largest of all, the leader, the one who carried stolen treasure around his neck. He was alone. His dreams were shattered. His anger had drained away. He did not even feel grief. Now all he wished to do was hide. He ran through the rays of the rising sun until he came to a house with a broken roof and a door that swung wide. The goblin ran towards it. He crept through the open doorway and looked around. This house was dark and surely deserted, for it was foul with stinking, half-chewed bones, and everything was thick with dust. Just to be completely safe, however, the last goblin crawled beneath the sagging bed. Here is a hiding place I can be sure of, he said to himself. But later that night, when he was fast asleep, the owner of that house came back. The owner was a knight, the head of his clan. He had been away from one summer raid and had celebrated his homecoming with 2 days and nights of feasting and a flood of ale. He stamped into his dark, neglected house and flung himself upon the bed. The rotten timbers cracked under his weight and fell. The knight cursed but did not move. In moments, he was snoring. He slept till noon. He slept till noon the following day and woke with a sore head amid the ruins of his bed. Grumbling, he rose and began to clear the wreckage away. And there, beneath the broken timbers, was the crushed and lifeless body of the last goblin. The knight stared, astonished. He knew what the dead thing was for. As he said later, who but a goblin could be so hideous? Oh, he knew what the dead thing was for, as he said it later, he who but a goblin could be so hideous. He saw that the goblin's hands were clutched tightly together over his chest. He pried the dead fingers apart and found a blood-stained bag which held a small, carved piece of wood. This must be a goblin talisman, he said to himself. The goblin carried it around his neck for protection, no doubt. Well, it did not help him much, but surely it will help me. The talisman of a goblin I've killed. Now that is a lucky charm indeed. So he took the blood-stained bag and hung it around his own thick neck. Then he slung the goblin's body over his shoulder and went out to boast of yet another brave deed, for he saw no reason to tell a soul that he had killed the goblin by mistake. Why spoil a good story with the truth? And so it was that the 7 goblins never found their place in the sun. The few of their kind who followed later were no more fortunate. So not one soul in the land of dragons ever knew them, and no one ever heard the tale they had to tell. The end, the end, the end, the end. That was The 7 Goblins, one of my favorite stories from this book. I hope you enjoyed listening to me read it. I'm sorry I stumbled a couple times. It happens. It's late. I hope you enjoyed the fireplace sounds in the background, if you could hear those. I thought it would be a nice, cozy touch. If you'd like me to read another story from this book, let me know in the